Hey guys, what's up? It's Chris, episode 34 of the Prodigy Maker Show. Tonight, I'm here with Sammy. Sammy's taking a nap, so Sammy's my academy dog. It'll just be me. We're going to talk about early specialization and playing multiple sports for young children, primarily focused on junior development, something I've been writing about a lot recently. And I also wanted to touch on some of my favorite sports to cross-train for tennis. So I think it'll be a great show. I did have some mailbox questions. I know that I will try to answer at least one. One was on footwork. So we're going to talk about footwork at the end of the show. I think it was a stance question on open stance versus closed in different situations on the court. So we'll get into the mailbox a little bit later. But let's dive into multiple sports and early specialization. It's a really big topic, probably could take up multiple hours. I don't want to go too crazy with the hours. Last show we did, I think it topped 2 hours. I think it was a lot for people to digest, so I'm going to try to stay around, sometimes we go an hour, hour and a half. I'll try to stay within the hour mark as we rap about multiple sports and early specialization, because I think it's a complex topic. I don't want to go too in-depth into the sports science because I think it'll be a little bit bland, and at the end of the day we'll end up with a non-answer because I think the sports science is not definitive. I know that it's very controversial. A lot of people get upset when I challenge the studies that are out there and the research that's out there, but I just don't think they're conclusive or definitive, and I think a lot of the studies are potentially flawed and biased, and they may not be specific enough to tennis to make good conclusions. But nevertheless, you have experts in the tennis world now, sports scientists and doctors, especially doctors, who are recommending that children always play multiple sports and that children should never specialize early, that children should take many months off per year from tennis to avoid injury and burnout and things like that. And I just think that those types of recommendations are well-meaning, of course, because the doctors want children to be healthy. They want well-rounded athletes in whatever sport they're giving recommendations for, in this case tennis. But in many respects, I think that the recommendations are misguided and under-supported by the evidence out there, and in the end can work as a disservice to players who are and families who are pursuing high performance, who are trying to achieve a very high level in the game. I think that the most common recommendations that you hear are a little bit off. So maybe we should talk about that first, because, for example, there are doctors now in the tennis world who are pushing a movement to get kids to take 3 months off a year, for example, to take significant time off, and to always play multiple sports, or to play multiple sports until a child is past puberty, maybe 13, 14 for boys. And are those good recommendations? This is a common question that parents have for me. What should we do for our kid? Should we play a lot of sports when the kid's young? Should we just focus on tennis? Is there a way to do that in that's healthy, that reduces the risk of burnout, but also gets us on the road to being a top college player or a professional player? So my focus is on that type of those type of scenarios where a kid is looking to achieve at a very high level in tennis, and I have to advise parents on what they should do for their kid, or they might have siblings or multiple kids. So this is where the crossroads of the scientific recommendations, the doctors, and what research there is out there, what those recommendations are, and the practical recommendations I have to give parents, and I don't think they always align. So most experts, quote unquote, or sports scientists or doctors will recommend that kids play multiple sports. At least the current recommendations are you play multiple sports. You don't specialize early. The definition of specialization is also important to understand. For scientists, the definition of specialization is typically to play tennis, only tennis, solely tennis, to the exclusion of everything else, which I don't think is a very good definition for early specialization. For me, early specialization is prioritizing tennis and tennis development over your other sports. I don't think I've ever had a kid that I've trained who didn't play some other sport, at least one, to support their tennis. I guess it's possible. It'd be a very small percentage of the students that I've ever worked with, and I've had a number of top national ranked players, a lot of kids in Division I with scholarships, full scholarships, and some of my students now are going to branch out on the professional tour. I've never had, a Grand Slam champion. That's a goal that I have. I've never had a top 100 player yet, so I'm working on that. But I've been around the game enough and around other coaches who have developed players like that to get a glimpse of what those kids are doing, and I think that informs my judgment. And I know from working with many of the top national ranked kids in the U.S., the ones that I've developed, I've seen how the parents operate, and I've seen how much those kids are playing tennis versus other sports, and I think that also gives me some insight into what the top kids are doing, the top national ranked kids versus the others, and the kids who are making top Division I, for example, versus kids who are playing lower level college or typically lower level college like Division III college. And I think I have a better perspective on that than some of the recommendations that you see from the scientists and doctors who, in my opinion, are a bit out of touch. So typically what they will say, typical doctor recommendation would be multiple sports, don't specialize early, wait until the teenage years to really get into tennis more seriously. And they cite a few different reasons why it's better to do it that way, that pathway to the top, rather than going more focused on tennis early on to the exclusion of most other sports. And the big thrusts are typically, they say that you're going to prevent injury, so there's a lot more overuse injury if you focus on only one sport when you're young. And they say that there's a higher risk of burnout, and they say that in the end you'll develop to be a better athlete. So on all three of those fronts, I understand completely what the arguments are, and I think they are. It's very important to consider those points, but I don't agree. I think that there's definitely a pathway to the top where you can specialize younger, and you can not exclude other sports, but you can use another sport or multiple sports to support your tennis. But tennis is the specialization. Tennis is the priority when you're training. And I think that's what many of the doctors and quote-unquote experts are kind of missing, that there's a way for many kids and families to do it in a healthy way, rather than just as a blanket statement saying that if you specialize early, you're bound to get injured, you're bound to you're probably going to burn out, and you're not going to become a good athlete. I mean, let's just take those one at a time. So do you have a higher risk of getting injured if you specialize in tennis when you're little? So parents are worried about that. Parents say, what if my kid really loves tennis and he's 5 or he's 6 or 7, or any age under 10? Should I let him play? Should I force him to play soccer or basketball or some other sport that kids typically play? Will that be healthier for him? And it has to depend on the kid. You should do this from a player-centered perspective. So if you have a little kid who really loves tennis, and I always tell parents this, I say, I have these talks with with parents all the time. We have planning meetings and discussions, and they ask me, how much tennis should we be playing per week? How much should we be focusing on tennis? And I say, do it, go for it. If the kid loves tennis and doesn't really like another sport, then let's do tennis. Let's focus on tennis, and let's try to do it in a healthy way where we don't take on those risks that the doctors and the sports scientists are referring to. So how can you do that? Let's take that, for example, as a first example. You have a little kid, and they love tennis, and they say they don't want to play anything else. There are kids like that. I've had students like that, and their passion is for tennis. So why not let them play tennis? And how can you mitigate the other risk factors? Well, for one, you can not be a psychopath or like a crazy parent or coach. You can make sure the kid's having fun on the court. You can make sure that they're not training to excess. The way the Spanish train the kids, maybe 3 hours a day, 3 hours and 15. You don't play 6 or 8 hours on the court. So if I ever have a parent start talking to me like that, like the alarm bells start going off. If a parent's saying, well, we got to get our 10,000 hours of mastery, we're going to do 8 hours a day of tennis, 6 or 8 hours a day with nothing else, and no other sports, and we're just going to grind it out that way. I mean, what human being on the planet doesn't see the problem with that? I mean, you don't have to be a genius PhD scientist, a researcher, or a doctor to understand that that's not a good plan for Johnny or little Lisa or whoever you got, whatever kid you got in front of you. That is not smart. And most likely you do take on more risk of an injury there and burnout. Like, that makes sense that you don't have to be a brainiac to figure that out. Don't have to be Einstein. But most, even the mad parents, the fanatics, the crazy parents don't typically take on that kind of risk. They're not that extreme, because if they're smart, if they're intelligent, they understand that it can be better for their kid to train a little less and do more physical work or cross-train in another sport. Usually not too many sports, because if you start taking on too many sports, you lose a lot of time. There's just only certain number of hours per day that you can train. And so most parents who are really serious about their kids' development understand that in the time that they have, they need to prioritize tennis, and they need to probably insert something else there for either for leisure or for cross training or for getting their putting to build character in their child or help them socially and emotionally. And most parents understand that that's going to make their kid better in the long run. But the idea that it's so risky to play a lot of tennis when you're little that is a false notion, because those risks can be mitigated. For example, let's say you go back to that kid who wants to play only tennis. Well, instead of forcing them to play another sport, the parent and the coaches can put them on a really good injury prevention program, a good prehab program. That will help to prevent an overuse injury, for example. Or they can be very careful with their training regimen. Make sure they're not doing too much overhead motion, too much serving, for example, because you can hit a lot of ground strokes for many hours a day with less risk than you can if you're doing a ton of overhead serving stuff. So it's smart decisions like that can allow a child to specialize more. And I use that's the way that I refer to specialization, maybe not the scientific term for specialization. So for me, specialization is a prioritization, a focus, but it doesn't necessarily exclude everything else, which from what I've seen, that is in most studies that I've read, and in most of the literature, that is the definition of specialization. There's a solo focus on tennis, solo. and there's an exclusion to everything else. So it's a little bit misleading, or people can easily misunderstand when doctors say, you shouldn't specialize, because the definition is so extreme. Of course you shouldn't specialize like that. It's too draconian. It's too extreme. Anyway, so you have a little kid who wants to play tennis. They love to play tennis. And I think it's crazy if a parent says, no, you can't play, because there's a doctor out there who says you have to take a lot of time off per year, or you might get injured, or you might burn out. A lot of parents are worried about burnout, the social emotional aspect of playing a lot in one sport. And again, I think with common sense, the risks of burnout can be mitigated. As a parent or a coach, you have to be very empathetic. You have to be very in tune with your player and feel what they're feeling. And I think it's parents who are tone deaf, or parents who don't have a lot of empathy, are the ones who they risk burnout the most. And coaches too. The same. It's whatever I'm saying here for parents, it's the same for coaches. If you have empathy, if you're feeling your player, if you're in tune with their emotions on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis, you can manage the risk of burnout. You can make the tennis fun for them. You can give them lots of different activities to do outside of tennis to keep them in a healthy place mentally and emotionally. So you can make the game more social for them even, but within tennis. You can do all of that within tennis without having to choose to play them in another sport. They don't have to play another sport. It's just a myth. I'm tired of reading it and seeing it everywhere that to develop a top player, they have to play multiple sports. Do a lot of players play? First of all, of course, the best athletes in the world play multiple sports. They're athletes. How many kids just play tennis at 2 or 3 and never ever try another sport, like any organized sport or another sport for fun? I mean, almost no one. It's just common sense. Kids who are athletic, they try different sports. So it's misleading to say that to be a great athlete you have to play multiple sports. It's more like the best athletes in the world, the best champions in the world, they were interested and were good at lots of different sports. It's like which came first, what caused what. They were great athletes and they liked to play lots of sports, and or they liked to play one other sport, or they were good at another sport, or they liked multiple sports because they were talented in those particular subjects. And so most great athletes and champions played more than one sport, and then they found one that they love. And usually, in my opinion, they started prioritizing or specializing. This is my term, specializing, which just means prioritizing. They prioritize that sport as soon as possible so that they could get the advantage, especially if a sport is technical and difficult to learn like tennis. Tennis is such a complex sport to master biomechanically, and it's an open sport, open skills, it's a dynamic sport, and there's a lot of decision making in tennis. So there's just so many aspects of tennis to master. It's a very difficult sport to master. So it makes sense that you would try to hone your skills and develop mastery from as young an age as possible so you could get an advantage over some of the other kids. The key is limiting the risk of burnout, limiting the risk of an injury, especially an injury. And the third part is making sure that your kid is a great, well-rounded athlete. And what I mean by well-rounded is not that they're good at lots of sports, but they have very good athletic ability. They are quick and agile and flexible and have a good range of good mobility, and they are strong in the places where they need to be strong for tennis. And they're explosive and things like that. They have good coordination, especially hand-eye coordination for tennis. They have good movement skills, all these basic building blocks of athleticism that sometimes, if a kid is only playing tennis, they can have some pockets where they're missing. But I think those pockets can be easily addressed with a good training regimen, a good athletic physical conditioning regimen, and on the injury side, you can easily develop a prehabilitation program to ensure that those kids are not at risk of an injury or higher risk of an injury because they're playing so much tennis. So to me, it's just common sense. As a parent, you got to be empathetic. You have to use your common sense. You have to know. You also have to have some knowledge about anatomy and physiology and exercise science and athletic training to make sure that your kid is that you're mitigating the risks for your child. Probably have some background in psychology, understand the psychology of childhood development. Just to have some knowledge in those areas will help you as a parent. If you don't, you can enlist the help of a coach who's trained in that or other specialists. But I don't want parents to think that if their child really loves tennis, and I think many of the greats, historically, they knew they wanted to be tennis players from a very young age. And many of them played from the womb. They played from an infant. They've been playing when they were in the crib. And I don't want parents to think that is damaging to a child. Now, they should be on the lookout. They should be vigilant for the risks that the doctors and sports scientists talk about. They should be on the lookout for signs of burnout. They should be on the lookout for signs of overtraining and overuse injuries. And they should be on the lookout for potential pockets of where the player is lacking athleticism. But those things are trainable, and the risks in those areas can be mitigated. And that's what I'm getting at. So I hope you guys understand. I've been writing about this. I've been posting online. I've been writing articles for my blog about this topic last couple weeks. It's such apparently it's a very controversial topic because people get so heated when I challenge sort of the status quo, the common recommendations of today. The basic sports science recommendations are against what I'm saying here. They are that you should multiple sports, avoid early specialization at all costs, and or your kid's going to get injured. Your kid's going to be going to have a serious social emotional disorder. They're going to burn out for sure. They're not going to be a good athlete. They can't make it to the top. I mean, these are kind of the messages of the day, the messages du jour, and I just think they're really missing the mark, and they're based on inconclusive data and research. And I just wanted to point out a countervailing take on it, perspective, and just I was just pilloried online. So many people were very upset that I would say such a thing. How could it be when there's so much research, so much data on this or that? But when you start to look at the studies one by one, I'm not going to do that this show. I could do it another show. I think it'd be a pretty boring show. And in the end, we just end up in the same place arguing about something that's not fully proven yet. But if you look at study after study, you'll see that either the study is not specifically about tennis, or the conclusions of the study are not clear. You can't draw a direct line from A to B, or the study may be outdated, or it could be maybe flawed in some other way. But you got to go look one by one, and you see, how the current recommendations are flawed, and the idea that you're bound to injure your player, you're bound to burn out your player, you're bound to develop a poor athlete if you focus on tennis when you're young. Though that opinion is, the jury's still out on that, and I think that's really important for parents to understand. You should definitely be cautious about those areas with your child. Of course, who wants to burn out their kid? Who wants to blow out their kid's shoulder? or have some other overuse injury. Who wants to develop a subpar athlete? No parent wants that. No coach wants that either. But it seems that the current recommendations have shifted so far to the multi-sport, avoid early specialization model that, in my opinion, it is detrimental to many kids who want to be great. They want to be great tennis players. Maybe they want to be top college players. Maybe they want to be professional players. Maybe they want to win a Grand Slam. They want to be a superstar of the world. And I just don't think you can. I just don't think those kids should be held back because of some bogus recommendations. That's kind of how I feel about it. So multiple sports for kids. Most of my students play multiple sports. They probably play. I try to play one other sport. When I talk to parents, I say, let's do tennis and let's try to get all the tennis skills sharp. Let's sharpen them. Let's make this kid into a better athlete. The athleticism is a big priority for me, but that doesn't have to be with another sport. You can build a good athlete. Imagine hiring a trainer and saying, okay, I want you to train my kid to be a really good athlete, and then we're going to play lots of tennis. We're only going to play tennis, but I'm going to have a really good athletic trainer who knows his or her business, and they're going to be helping my kid become a better athlete, and they're going to help my kid with the prehabilitation program, and we're going to be very empathetic, and we're going to listen to this player, and we're going to train a lot of tennis, but we're going to be really careful, make sure they're having fun, that there's some social outlets for the child, and that they're developing a healthy character and self-esteem, and their mental and emotional well-being is good. If that type of model I think is very reasonable for a kid who just wants to play tennis. So I think that there are examples of that out there on the junior circuit, parents doing that. And that's what I always recommend to parents. I say, if you're going to do it, if you're going to do tennis, you got to have those other parts. So does that make sense to you guys? If you're going to do solo tennis, like really focusing on tennis, you got to have a trainer in the mix doing the athletic side, because you don't want to risk mediocre athletic development. And you have to be very empathetic, and you have to really be in touch with your players' feelings and their mental state on a regular basis. So that can be you, or could be a psychologist. I don't usually recommend working with a psychologist. I think the parents should do that. If you have parents who are very callous, who lack empathy, I think that is going to jack up the risk for burnout and potentially for injuries too. Because a parent who doesn't have who can't feel what the child's feeling, they're going to push them too hard, and they're going to be too disciplined or too demanding of the child, and that's where you get all of these problems. And probably the sports scientists and doctors are trying to give recommendations to protect children from they are trying to protect children from these types of influences, maybe bad parenting or bad coaching. Coaches can also be quite callous and lack empathy. So remember, everything that I'm saying here applies to any coach who's working with the child as well. Whether it's parent or coach, these my opinions hold. So yeah, so you have a child who wants to play tennis. If you support them with those healthy things, I think you can do it, and you shouldn't be scared. You shouldn't. You should be worried. You should be cautious. You should be vigilant, but you shouldn't be condemned by the scientific community and by the medical community for that you're going to destroy your kid. Because I think there are many examples, and I've seen personally many examples that that's not the case. And that's good parenting. That's not bad parenting. That's listening to your child, listening to the player. Player says, I want to do tennis. It's not you telling the kid that you want them to play only tennis, or it's not some weird dynamic like that. It's like you like actually genuinely listen to the player, and you can have a kid 5, 6 years old who says, I love tennis. I want to play more tennis. I want to play a lot of tennis. I want to play 20 hours of tennis a week. And I think there's a way to do that that speeds that child's development along, but with the right supports in place, can also mitigate any of the risks that we've been discussing. I think you can do it in a healthy way, and I think I've advised parents to do it that way when their kid loves tennis. Now, let's say, for example, you got a kid who's not so sure. You know, he likes tennis, she likes tennis, but at the same time, she also likes soccer, or she also likes whatever, track, or basketball, or, it doesn't matter, swimming. So now it's more complicated, because when you have a kid who likes multiple sports, the biggest problem that I discuss with parents is finding time. So I think it's wrong, it's probably really bad parenting to say, no, you have to specialize in tennis. That should be condemned. Okay, when a parent says to a kid who has a passion for more than one sport, a young kid, let's say 6 or 7 or 8, and the parent says, no, we're going to specialize you in only tennis. And you're not allowed to play basketball. You're not allowed to play soccer. You're not allowed to do this. We've got to get our 10,000 hours, and we're going to grind this into, the parents take on that approach. Parents who take that approach, that is wrong, okay? That is probably ethically wrong, and it's going to really mess up your kid in the long run. And they might make it for a certain number of years, but there's definitely a high risk of burnout there, and potentially a risk of injury. The injury is debatable, right? The research on that, you have to prove a link between training specifically for tennis and how many hours per week, and then connected to a higher percentage of injury risk. It's difficult to prove conclusively. All of these things are difficult to prove conclusively. Proving that burnout risk is higher probably can't be proven conclusively right now. And there's not a lot of social emotional research on this topic, especially specifically related to tennis. The last summary of studies that I read, they said there were no current studies out on psychosocial development vis-a-vis early specialization. So that was as of 2015. So you figure there's not much out there on psychosocial development, and there's more out there on overuse injury in kids who specialize. But still, to prove a link, to make a direct line from A to B in those types of studies is I think impossible to do, or close to impossible. Anyway, so the big risk for parents is when your child, or the danger for parents is when your child likes multiple sports, you should respect that. The danger is to force them to play only one sport. That's wrong. That's bad. It's really bad. And it's bad, just ethically bad, or morally bad as a parent, but also puts them into those, I think it's common sense, whether it can be proven or not. I think it puts them into a higher risk for those potential pitfalls that we talked about. I think it's best. What I tell parents is try to get it down to 2 sports. I think 2 sports works really well, because then you have a little time for the injury prevention work, and you have a little time maybe for other outlets for the kid. They got to have fun. These are children. But you don't want to... One of the dangers that I see is if a kid likes a lot of sports, and then the parents start taking them around to like 2, 3, more than 2, 3 or 4 different sports, then they're not playing that much tennis. From my perspective as a tennis coach, I don't like that, because usually the development in the skills start deteriorating, or they don't learn their skills as quickly. And so what happens is they start falling behind their peers. So that is, for me, the biggest danger of doing lots of sports. If you do lots of sports when you're little, many times your tennis skills are not as polished. You don't master the tennis skills as quickly, and you can fall behind peers. And I think that's a really dangerous place to be. For me, and for anyone who wants a kid to be a high-performance player, I don't like falling too many years behind other kids who are specializing. But I'm using the word specializing in terms of prioritizing. So for the kid, maybe I should be more careful. Specialize is kind of a loaded word. But for the kids who are prioritizing tennis versus the kids who are doing more, let's say more than 2 sports, 3 or 4 sports, I think there's just not enough time in the week for those kids to develop the tennis skills the way they need to, and so they start falling behind. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. As the years start ticking by, the sales pitch from multi-sport advocates is that those kids who are playing lots of sports will be better athletes in the long run, and that sometime in the future they're going to close the gap. And I just don't believe that. It can happen with a very talented kid, perhaps. They can close the gap, but many times, in my experience, the gap is too great for the athlete to close it in developing their tennis skills later. Like, for example, 13 or 14 starting to really prioritize tennis. For me, I would never advise that to a parent. Never. Maybe it comes from my own personal experience, because I started specializing in tennis around that age. I'm just going to use those words interchangeably. I don't care what the scientific definition. I like to be able to use both words. Okay, but for me, I started really prioritizing tennis at around 14, and man, that was such a tough hill to climb. It's a big comeback. You're a couple laps behind in that race, and it's really tough. And I don't think I ever overcame some of those. I never was able to close the gap with some of the kids who started earlier than I did, and that's a big bummer, man. I wish maybe someone had told me to give up basketball a little sooner. I was a very good basketball player. I played high school ball, and maybe my coach should have kind of nudged me at 11 or 12 and said, hey, let's start doing a little more tennis here. But the recommendations that you see now do not encourage that at all. They discourage that type of conversation. And that is, I guess, where I get into hot water, because I disagree with those current recommendations. I tell parents all the time, let's try to get this down to 2 sports. 2 sports is real good. That's Rafa, that's Andy Murray playing tennis and soccer. Tennis and soccer is a great combo. A lot of athletes in Europe do that. That's very common. Could be anything. Could be tennis and basketball. Could be tennis and you name the sport. We can talk about the favorite cross-training sports of coaches and parents a little bit later. That's kind of a fun discussion. I've written some articles, and I wrote a really good article for New York Tennis Magazine where I talked about my top 10 favorite cross-training sports for tennis. So that is a subject that I'm interested in. And I've come across a lot of interesting sports that kids have chosen to add into their regimen, along with, of course, all their tennis training. But I really disagree I really disagree with playing too many sports, because there's how many hours you have during the week to train. The tennis starts to get diluted. The kid spends less time learning the good technique and less time on the court hitting balls. They start falling more and more behind. And I don't believe the sales pitch that they're going to catch up, that every kid who plays multiple sports is going to catch up. So, for example, you have, let's use concrete examples. You have one kid, 5 years old, loves tennis, right? Doesn't want to play anything else. So from 5 to 10, that little tiger is playing 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week, let's say, doing a lot of athletic training on the side with the trainer and doing a lot of prehabilitation work. To me, that's the dream. That's the dream. If you can get that, you're going to have a kid at 10 who's so far ahead of other 10-year-olds. It's going to be unbelievable. Or let's say from 5 to 12. By the time when that kid's 12, I mean, for me, those are the kids that have a chance to maybe go on tour before college. These are the Coco Gauffs and the Sophia Kennons and the really special prodigies, the Martina Hingises and the Agassiz and the Rafa Nadals. You know, these are players who are so many years ahead of their peers that they're able to go on tour years before other kids who are their age, you know. And there's many other examples of that. I'm sure you guys can think of it, you know. Guys, I appreciate your waves. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. I see all of you out there. I appreciate all the support you guys give the show. Thank you for tuning in live. It's Thursday night. Excited to be rapping with you guys, talking a little early specialization in multiple sports. So many kids start that way, and yeah, maybe they do like a little other, maybe they do another sport on the side. You know, that kid could do a little soccer or a little something or else or whatever. You know, you have to be really careful with believing that the other sports. Here's another myth. You have to be really careful that quick myth. Be very careful with the idea that if you play other sports, your kid's going to be a balanced athlete and your kid's going to prevent injuries. That's a myth. There are some sports that complement tennis really well and some sports that don't. In a recent essay that I wrote, I mentioned, for example, the sport of swimming. So in tennis, if you're doing a lot of serving, which you shouldn't be doing when the kids are young anyway, you shouldn't be doing too much serving. That's like one of the big risk factors for a shoulder injury. But let's say you're serving, right? And on the side, your kid loves to swim, and your kid's doing a lot of freestyle swimming. Well, that's also overhand movement. So now you're overloading the shoulders, and you create a double risk of injury in the shoulder. But you thought as a parent that you're doing multiple sports, and so you're doing the healthy thing for your kids. So you just have to be really specific and really understand what each sport your child's doing, what those sports are contributing to their overall athleticism, how they're wearing on the body, and also the positive aspects too. So you just have to understand very clearly what the positives and negatives are of every sport that you choose for your kid in terms of their athletic development. And I just think the easiest way to do it, and the easiest for time, is if your kid wants to do another sport, you sort of have a talk with them and you say, all right, we'll do one other sport, and that'll be they'll have these two sports going on. Tennis will be the priority, and we'll have this secondary sport. You know, a lot of kids in Europe like to do soccer, and that's fine. Soccer is a good complementary sport for tennis. We can talk about that a little bit later, but you know, because it's great for the footwork, it builds good endurance, it's very good in the eye-foot coordination, and you know, it's healthy that way for tennis. But you try to get it down to two sports, like the way Rafa did it. You know, tennis and soccer. And Uncle Tony admits this, and he says he should have done more injury prevention work for Rafa. You know, he should have done more strength and conditioning work for Rafa. They really didn't do anything. He said when Rafa was a kid, they didn't do any off-court work like that. It was just sort of tennis, the training in tennis, and his soccer training. And Tony says if he were going to do it again, he would make sure he did more injury prevention work with Rafa. And I think that's a very smart observation from Tony, and very honest of him to admit that at that time he thought that just tennis and soccer was enough. And oftentimes the other sports that you're doing are not enough. There are positives to every sport. They work certain areas of the body. You have to understand how each sport affects the body physiologically. And there are negatives to every sport too. So you really have to be clear about what each sport is doing for your kid. in a positive, negative way. And the best way to be safe is just to have a good prehab program, I think. And I always recommend that to parents is just make sure no matter what sports you're doing, is to, just in case there's anything slipping through the cracks, or there's some pockets where we're missing injury prevention, is to craft a program specifically for prehab, and also for just a simple athleticism program, because you can't always rely on this the other sport or the other sports to develop the athlete. Usually kids who play lots of sports are going to become very well-rounded athletes, but there may be detriments. If a kid, sometimes you have a kid who loves tennis and they're playing soccer. Let's say they're playing soccer, but they really like to be goalie, or they're playing a sport that doesn't build agility that well, or doesn't build stamina that well, or whatever other athletic, skill or facet that you want for your child. You have to be aware of that and maybe train it in a different way, because the sport's not going to supply that. If the kid is playing goalie, that's going to be really good for their reactions, like their eyes, quick hands, quick reaction. It's not going to do much for their stamina. Not going to do not much for their footwork and movement. Their coordination maybe a little bit, but you just have to understand not only the sports, but what your child is doing in the sport, the positions they're playing. It's just such a myth when people say, "Oh, you play basketball, play soccer, play other sports, and your kid is guaranteed to be injury-free, less likely to have an injury, and more likely to be a better athlete." Sort of true, but also could be very false. For example, another example, your kid plays on a team, but they're riding the bench a lot. That's not a really good use of their time. The sport only works if the kid's playing a lot. The other sports only work if the kids are using the body in a way that's going to help them athletically for tennis. So you just have to understand the important specific aspects of each sport, and also just practically, is your kid playing enough of the sport? Is it a good use of their time? Many times playing in an organized team, may not be the best use of their time if they're really serious about becoming a great tennis player. So again, getting back to my example, you have a kid, one example, 5 to 12, playing mostly tennis, which is still not the scientific definition of specialization, but in my mind, they're specializing. They're prioritizing tennis, and then maybe supplementing with another sport, let's say soccer, for example, and then doing a little bit of prehab training. And then it's the parent or coach's job to look at the kid and say, okay, are we missing anything athletically here? Does this kid need more agility training? Does this kid need a little more coordination training? Does the kid struggle in some other facet of their athleticism? And then you have to plug that in. It's not enough to just say, "Oh, we're playing soccer, so my kid's a great athlete now, right? He's going to be a great athlete, guaranteed." And I think it's wrong to try to. It's in fact inefficient to try to get that athleticism with too many sports. It's much more efficient to train the kid specifically on what they need athletically than to do soccer, basketball, track and field, whatever other sports. It's not efficient to do it that way. It's much better just to train it in. It saves a lot of time, and time is an important factor if you're trying to develop a champion. And I've done podcasts on this, on the time. Time is important. Your use of time. Achieving mastery in a certain amount of time. So then you have this is where it gets tricky, because if you have another little champion, right, 5 years old, they're not ready to specialize in tennis. Please, God, don't force them to play only tennis, because that's going to mess that kid up. I know it. I don't need a research. I'm a dad with 4 kids, and I just don't need any conclusive scientific evidence, because I don't think it's quite out there. Despite what my critics say, I just know from common sense, if you take that kid and you force him into only tennis, it's going to end up bad. It's going to end up bad one way or the other. So please don't do that. Let them play another sport or two for in the interim, but try to steer them towards one other sport that they really like. Try to get it down to 2 sports. That way you have much better time management. And the kid's getting all of the athletic benefits of playing another sport. And that leaves you a little time to fill in pockets of athletic conditioning where they might need it, and also to fill in a little bit of prehabilitation for that child, injury prevention work. Because if they're just doing 3 sports or 4 sports, it's going to be really hard to find the time for prehab. It's going to be hard to find the time for maybe the specific athletic conditioning that they might need, specific to them, rather than just getting it generically through lots of sports, which I think is rather inefficient. But with that type of kid, it can be, for me, the biggest risk is, let's say by the time they turn 12, if the parent is allowing them to play too many sports, they're going to be probably a pretty good athlete at 12, but they're going to be so far behind the kid who was specializing 5 to 12 that I don't think they'll be able to catch up. The only exception would be just an off-the-charts athlete, like a Yannick Sinner. Like Sinner is an example of just off the top of my head, who was doing another sport, started concentrating on tennis at a late age, and was able to make top 100 within just a few years. I mean, that is incredible, and just a testament to his talent as an athlete. But I certainly wouldn't use that as a model for development for most children. And I think that in many respects, and this also gets me into trouble when I say this, but the less your kid's talent is, the more they should be specializing early. And I think I've heard people say it the opposite way, like if they're really talented, they should specialize early. And that's probably true too. So I guess I feel for both, because tennis is so hard to learn. I think if you're really talented, yeah, you should probably get the head start and learn as much as you can, as fast as you can, so you can develop mastery sooner. But on the other hand, if you're not that talented, please God, don't wait until 14 to specialize in tennis, because you're just going to be so far behind the curve. You're going to be so far behind in the race against the other children that you're not going to catch up. And what I find is the kids who are decent to good athletes, if they're waiting really long, like to 13 or 14 to specialize in tennis, they're going to end up somewhere in playing college ball, probably low-level college ball. And they don't have a chance in hell of playing professional tennis. Now, you take the same kid who's a decent to good athlete, and if they have a passion for tennis and they're 5, 6 years old, 7 years old, and they really go after their skills at that young age, and the parents are able to guide them and focus them there and do it in a healthy way, keep them from getting burnt out, keep them from getting hurt through overuse. Now, that kid who's just moderately talented really could play high-level college tennis, could be a Division I recruit, full scholarship player, could probably be successful on the pro tour, probably will not be a Grand Slam winner, will not be a superstar on the pro tour, but could be a pretty decent journeyman. That's how I see that. And you never hear this discussion from the scientists and the doctors, the experts. I'm sure I know many coaches may agree with me, but a lot of coaches don't. Man, it's such a divisive issue. I had no clue. I had no idea it was such a hot button topic. People are up in arms when I started talking like this. I posted some articles online, and people are really upset. Like what I'm saying is very, very harmful to children. I think it's the opposite. It respects children, and it's player-centered. My philosophy, my approach. So that's the way I see it, guys. I would caution you as parents and any coaches who are listening or watching the show is don't hold your kids back. If they love tennis, let them play tennis. just make sure that they have a good prehab program in place and a good athletic program in place, and that please listen to your child. Use common sense and don't overtrain them and don't over demand from them. Be careful and be empathetic. Listen to your child and feel what they're feeling and make adjustments as you go along the journey. And if you do that, I think you can play tennis and specialize in tennis at a very young age. On the flip side, if you have a kid who is not sure about tennis, please God, don't force them to play tennis because you think it's the only way. You're going to have to bring them to the top in a slightly different pathway. And for me, that pathway is guiding them not to play 3 or 4 sports, but to try to play really just one supplementary sport. And also for them, make sure that they have good athletic development, filling in any athletic gaps that are missing, and you have a strong prehabilitation program in place. Because after all, playing the other sport, or if you have to play 2 sports, you can do it. It's just a time factor. It's not always going to ensure that they're healthy and injury-free. So those are my basic recommendations to parents and also any coaches. You got to make sure you don't fall too far behind in the tennis skills. If you fall too far behind in the race, there's just a gap that grows that you cannot leap over. You cannot catch up at some point to the kids who are early specializers. So you have to understand that and make sure that even when your kid is playing multiple sports, that they're getting a lot of good tennis training, a lot of hours on the court. They're getting a lot of good skills and technical development because tennis is such a technical sport. They have to have that good biomechanical base. If you do that, when they get older and they get mature enough and they start thinking about specializing in tennis, let's say hopefully by 10 or 11 or 12, hopefully not too long, that gap will be minimized and that they'll be able to catch up to their peers or the kids who are ahead of them. That's really important, to minimize the gap. So that would be my bottom line advice to you. If you have a multi-sport kid, you have a kid, don't shut them down, don't force them to play only tennis, but make sure that the gap, that the chasm is not too wide, is not too long, and that way, when they do decide to really get serious about their tennis, that they have a good technical base and that they're able to close the gap and catch up to their peers. That's really important because if the gap is too big, your kid's going to feel frustrated and sometimes they feel hopeless. Sometimes that can backfire into a burnout situation. The kid feels that they're so far behind, they lose motivation. That can be damaging to a kid's psyche as well. You don't hear people talking about that too much. So make sure they don't fall too far behind. Use sports for what they help with. Fill in the pockets that are missing athletically and injury prevention wise, and try to steer those kids into just one extra sport if possible. Try not to do like 3 or 4 sports because of the time issue. Very inefficient way to do it that way. So those would be my bottom line recommendations. So let's talk a little bit about my favorite sports for cross training. Soccer is probably one of the top. It's very popular. Soccer is great because it builds stamina and builds good footwork and movement. Let's talk about just a few of my favorites. What's one that I love that is underrated or under-discussed? I think martial arts is a really good one. You have to be careful with martial arts not to get injured, obviously, because if there's sparring involved or live fighting, it can be quite dangerous. Those sports can be quite dangerous, but any martial art I think is really good for kids. I always recommend to the families that I work with, the parents who I work with, to try to get their kids into martial arts, not only for the physical benefits, but also for the mental and emotional benefits. Many martial arts teach discipline. As you guys may know, I'm a big martial artist myself. I do a lot of mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu and boxing and kickboxing, and so this is a real passion of mine, a hobby of mine. I just think there's so many great benefits for children. Any martial art, karate, taekwondo, you name it, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but you have to be really careful on the injury side. And I just think from a mental and emotional point of view, martial arts, fighting, makes a child really tough. Boxing, kickboxing, any kind of spar. If you can get them into sparring, you're going to have a little warrior out there on the tennis court, and I just love that. So I always tell parents that if they can get the kid into martial arts, it's great. Obviously, the agility and coordination and flexibility aspects of martial arts are also huge benefits. So a huge believer in martial arts, and I think many times parents don't think of martial arts as an option for children, but it's, in my opinion, a really good one. I've had a lot of success with some of my students doing martial arts for cross-training. I like basketball. I played a lot of basketball. I'm a big basketball fan. I think it's really good for the hands and the feet, good for the coordination. You know, in all these sports, you have to be careful about getting pushed or thrown down and getting hurt. Basketball is, these sports are also good. The team sports are also very good for building character and building some of the personal values, the human values of a kid. So sometimes parents will put their kids into team sports so that they can learn to work with others, and so they can develop better communication skills and things like that. Or maybe sometimes it's a good social outlet. So there's also many benefits to these team sports aside from the athletic benefits. What other sports do I like? You know, some of my students have had success in hockey. I've had some really top national players who have cross-trained in hockey, believe it or not. Problem with hockey is it's really expensive. There's a lot of equipment. You got to get to the ice rink. I find it's not as efficient a sport as some, and it's expensive. That's sort of a negative on hockey, but it's actually very good cross-training for tennis because you learn to skate on an unstable surface, the ice, and you are manipulating a stick very similar to how you manipulate a racket, and it's great for the reactions, and it has many physical benefits. Also, hockey players tend to be quite tough, which is always good on the tennis court. If you don't want to develop a soft marshmallow type kid on the tennis court, you need to get a warrior out there. So hockey's good for that, especially if there's checking. Football is real good for that. You know, playing football, you have risk of concussions, you have risk of injuries, but man, it makes a tough kid. Every kid that I've coached in tennis who played football or hockey or any kind of contact sport, martial arts contact sport, they've been a soldier on the court. You know, I love having kids like that. A kid tells me he played football, I love it. Kid tells me they did karate for 5 years, I love that. Kid tells me that they played hockey, that's great. Or lacrosse, you know, tough sport. A sport that has physical contact, those kids are going to be little warriors on the tennis court. It's always good for me. Gymnastics is another one that I really love. Gymnastics is fantastic for tennis players. Doesn't really work the coordination with like hand-eye, foot-eye that much, the way soccer or basketball does. But wow, develop gymnastics. The kids who I've coached who did gymnastics have a very good body awareness, very good flexibility, very good agility typically, and they're strong. You know, they have good strength to weight ratio. You know, so they're very athletic in those respects. You know, so I think gymnastics is excellent, especially for younger kids. That would be a great cross-training sport if the kids like it. You know, again, you have to find what your child likes. I would say to parents I know we have a lot of parents who watch the show and listen to the podcast, try not to force your kid into a sport because you think it's the best sport for them to support their tennis. That's just bonehead. It's just bad parenting. Just try to talk to your kid and find out what they like. You know, the kid's going to tell you what they like. My kids, you know, I had all sorts of ideas for my kids. I wanted them to play tennis. None of my kids play tennis. They play for fun, but none of them play seriously. And I would never try to force them to play tennis competitively if they didn't want to or in any organized way. But ask your child, just sit them down and talk to them, communicate with them and say, hey, you know, we know you love tennis. What's another sport that you'd like to play? And they'll say, oh, I like soccer, or I don't like soccer, or I really like to try karate, or I'd really like to be on the basketball team this year. I mean, like, just talk to your kid and suss it out that way, figure it out that way. That's the best way to do it. And like I said, if the kid says to you, if your child says to you, I don't really like any other sports, I just want to play tennis, please don't discount that. That's a great piece of information, of intelligence for you. Go with that. Don't listen to the doctors on that. Go with that and just make sure, or listen to the doctors in the sense that make sure you have a plan in place to prevent burnout and prevent injuries, and that they get good overall athletic enhancement. So do that. Listen to the doctors in that sense, but don't listen to the doctors in the sense that you say, oh, no, you have to play multiple sports because you can't be a great athlete, or you're going to burn out if you don't play multiple sports. Don't think that way. That's misguided. Yeah, so there's many other sports, guys. You can always leave me a comment and let me know what sports you love. It could be a long list, but I think those are good. Any one of those are good. The most important thing is that the sport that your kid enjoys, so it's a healthy outlet for them. And then to figure out whatever they love to do, figure out the positives and negatives athletically and in terms of injuries for your child, injuries or injury prevention, and then supplement the supplemental sport with some injury prevention program or some athletic enhancement training. If you do that, you're really on a healthy road, a road to success, I believe. All right. We have one grab bag from the mailbox, or it's from our mailbox segment. At the end of the show, I have my buddy Tomas. I think it's Tomas, where are you from? You're from Europe? I think Tomas is from Europe. He likes to send me an email with the question for the week. So I think Tomas had a question about open stance versus closed. Where in the court should you use open stance versus closed? And so, in general, it's a pretty easy question to answer in my mind. In general, I like to tell my players when they're in the center of the court and they can move forward to try to step in with a closed or neutral stance. And I try to differentiate that from when they're moving laterally to the sides of the court. So from the baseline, I try to encourage a semi-open to open stance when players are moving wide. That can be with the backhand too. And that will aid in the recovery, and it can also aid in power production. You can load and lift off the ground with semi-open and open stances. And I like to have a balance, so I like to also teach my students to have a good forward stance where they step in, whether you want to call that closed or neutral. I think that players should master both, and especially with young players, it doesn't matter the age, but especially with young players, I like to teach both in concert together. So I never like to, some coaches always say teach closed. Some coaches are really adamant about teaching open stance, and I just think you should master all of those foot skills and everything, all the stances there. I think that's a smart way to develop children. And in another situation, moving forward, when you're moving forward into the midcourt, typically on lower balls that are farther away, you use a closed stance or a neutral stance. You step down into the court because it gets you closer to the ball. And when the ball is rising up higher and it's closer to you, so the distance is not as great, that's when you see players typically load and explode with an open stance or semi-open stance. So that is also another key differentiator. When the ball is lower and farther in front, farther away, let's say near the service line, typically players will have to close that gap. They'll have to close that distance by sprinting and then stepping forward with for a right hand, let's say for a forehand, that would be with the left foot in a closed or neutral stance for a right-handed player. So you sprint up to the ball, and if it's low and short, you typically will step forward into that shot. And if the ball sits up more, it's a little closer to you distance-wise, higher balls, typically you see players load and explode in a more, you would say, maybe modern forehand technique, let's say, for example. On the backhand, it's a little different. Backhand, midcourt to transition ball, transition situation, transition ball is typically still closed. It's closed and neutral. The players will often jump up into a short ball, but you don't see as many players setting up with an open stance or semi-open stance, load and explode on the backhand on transition balls. There are some other foot skills involved there. There is diagonal power step sometimes that you see. So you'll set up in a semi-open, and then you'll lunge or power step diagonally forward into the closed stance. So it's sort of a combo hybrid deal. Sometimes you'll see that. So it'll be an open stance or semi-open stance setup with a closed stance lateral drive of the opposite leg. So you do see that configuration sometimes on the transition, but typically the transition is closed to neutral with a front foot hop. I teach that all the time to my students. The front foot hop is a fundamental skill on transition when you're moving into the midcourt. I know Tomas had a question about midcourt as well. I do teach the second variation, the semi-open stance with explosion, on higher balls, and also balls where you're moving to the side. So if you have a mid-court ball where you're moving to the side of the court near the singles sideline, that tends to be semi-open because you load off the outside leg there. It tends to be more comfortable for players rather than closing up their hips when they're far out to the side of the court on a shorter ball. So I hope that helps, Tomas. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions about those footwork situations and the stances. It is a very common question: when to use open, when to use closed, when to teach which stance should you teach first. I think you should teach both first. And I have a problem when I see coaches only teaching closed. I've seen that a lot, especially with young children. And I also have a concern when I see coaches teaching only open stance, especially because we don't have conclusive evidence on it, but many coaches are worried about injuries to the hip if players are using excessive open stance from a young age. And I am also concerned about that. So I like to see my players close up their stance when they can. I like to see at least a 50-50 deal. And I definitely don't like to see pure open stance in a little kid all the time because of the potential injury risk. So please be careful with that. Try to encourage your players to use the closed stance when it's appropriate, and teach them both stances, or all three of the whole range of stances, from closed to semi-open to open, so that they can have all of the foot skills they need depending on what situation they're in. All right, guys, it was a really good show. I hope I was able to sort of condense that big debate on multi-sport and early specialization training. It's a complex discussion. I hope I did it justice by simplifying the matters as much as possible. I just wanted the show to be good and useful for if there was a parent watching or a coach watching who wasn't sure how to train their player, that they would have some guidance on that, the guidance that I give to my students and the families that I work with and the parents that I work with. So I hope I was able to make that somewhat clear to you. If you have any questions about your own personal situation, please feel free to email me or message me. I'm always available to the audience to give advice. That's why I do the show. I enjoy giving advice to families out there and coaches and players. So if you have a specific situation, you're not sure whether your son or daughter should play this sport or that sport, or you're not sure how many hours a week your child should play in tennis, depending on their age. These are very, very common questions that parents have, and rightfully so. These are very important decisions that you need to make for your child, because at the end of the day, you don't want your child to get injured. You don't want your child to burn out from tennis. You want your child to become the best athlete they can be. All parents want that, and all coaches should want that as well. But at the same time, you don't want to hinder your child's tennis development. You want to give them the the best pathway they can have to become as good a player as they can be, to reach their highest lifetime UTR. And I just think the way the current recommendations are, many children will reach a mediocre UTR. They will underperform, and they won't reach the highest possible lifetime UTR that they could if they followed more of the recommendations along the guidance that I'm giving. So, guys, it was a great show. We have some cool stuff coming up. We have the summer camp, which we're busy with the sign-up season. So if you have a child and you'd like to train with me in the summer in the beautiful mountains of Vermont, we have a very serious high-performance camp there. Please get in touch with me. You can email or call me or text me, and I'd be happy to discuss summer with you. We have an exciting footwork workshop that we're filming this coming Monday. So I'm very excited. I will let you guys know more info about that, but it will be a great event. We're hosting that at my club in Vermont. It's at the Chris Lewitt Tennis Academy in Londonderry, Vermont. It's coming up this Monday. We still have space. If you're listening to this podcast or you're watching the show, there's still time. It's Thursday night, and we are doing the footwork workshop on Monday. We've got about, I think, 10 or so participants right now, so I'm excited. We have some coaches and parents and some players coming. We'll spend the whole day on learning my footwork system and developing world-class footwork and movement. I think it's going to be very good, very practical, a lot of on-court work. So let me know if you'd like to come to that workshop. That's on Monday, this coming Monday, I think is the 17th, 18th. I think it's the 18th. I'll have to check on that. This coming Monday. And what else we got going on? We have some exciting tournaments coming up at the club. We have a qualifier for the Paris World Championships. We're hosting that at my club in April, so I'm super excited about that. It's a U14 Vermont State qualifier. The winner of that tournament, or the top two, will go on to the Nationals in Washington, D.C., and they will have a chance to qualify for the World Championships U14 in Paris. So that's coming up in April, and we've got a ton of UTR tournaments in the summer. So if you do come to the summer camp, we've set up verified UTR events pretty much every weekend, so that the kids who are there, the campers, can train and also work on their UTR on the weekend. It's a fantastic setup. I think we have another Paris qualifier over the summer for 2021, so that'll be the future qualifier. The one in April is for the 2020 event. So I'm just excited about all the tournaments coming up at the club for the summer. And what other news do I have? I don't think I have any. Oh, we have 2 new courses coming out. If you go to our online school, clta.teachable.com, we have 2 new courses coming out. One is on the kick serve, and the other is we've filmed about 30 live private lessons with me on court, and they came out really well, and we're going to put those into a library for you guys. I have a lot of coaches who study with me and follow my work, so if you're a coach or a parent who's interested in developing your knowledge about how to run private lessons and learning my method, the way that I work with students, that'll be a really good course. It's more than 30 videos that we've done of my own private lessons on the court. I think that'll be really good. I know the kick serve course will be really popular. There's a lot of poor information out there on how to build a kick serve, so I'm excited to offer my own online course I promise you will be very good quality. It'll be my whole kick serve system. I think we did it from the workshop. We did it's a 1-day workshop, and we filmed it, and that's going up online very soon. And then we will be also putting the new footwork workshop, that will be going online as well. So we got some new online stuff coming out in 2020. You can always check that out at our online academy, clta.teachable.com. So guys, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate all the waves. I appreciate the support that you guys are giving the show and for helping us grow. Please share the show with friends, and give me likes and thumbs up whenever you can. I appreciate it. God bless. Have a good night. We'll see you on the next show.